But first, I'm joined by the chair of the Conservative Party, Oliver Dowden. Good morning, Mr. Dowden.
Good morning.
Can we just start with the issue that I think will still concern most people in this country? Is Omicron in retreat?
Well, we've seen some very promising data, whether that's in relation to infections or hospitalisations. And that, of course, hasn't happened by accident. It's happened because so many people have taken that booster vaccine. And thanks to the drive we gave it before Christmas, we've now got over 60% of the total population covered with the booster vaccine, and actually over 90% of over 50. So that gives us pause for hope and optimism that we may be emerging from the worst of Omicron. So it is good news, but it's thanks to all that hard work that is happening.
Should we then expect the lifting of the restrictions when the review comes in 10 days' time?
Well, it's always been my hope that we would have the Plan B restrictions for the shortest period possible. I'm under no doubt the kind of burdens this puts hospitality, wider business, schools and so on under, and I want us to get rid of those if we possibly can. The signs are encouraging, but clearly we'll wait to see the data ahead of that final decision.
But the likelihood is that that is what will happen. Those restrictions will be lifted unless we see something surprising in the data.
Well, it all seems to be heading in the right direction, particularly crucially in relation to hospitalisations, which seem to be plateauing. You've seen those very good headline numbers. It's heading in the right direction now. I'm very hopeful and optimistic, but clearly we'll await the data at the point of the decision before making that final decision.
Let me ask you about another big challenge facing government. Mr. Putin has essentially brewed a rather dangerous situation on the border with Ukraine. He's got 100,000 troops there waiting for his orders. The negotiations in Vienna this week basically drew a blank. What's the government doing to avoid war?
Well, it is important that we have that kind of engagement that we saw in Vienna, and we were represented by Minister Cleverly at that. We continue to work with the United States and with our allies, and we need to continue to be robust, as we have been, in saying to Russia that if it infringes on the sovereignty of the Ukraine, it will face severe consequences. We need to be united in sending that message, and we are.
What do severe consequences look like? I mean, what does that mean?
Well, we have said that there will be severe economic consequences, sanctions regimes and so on, where that happen. Russia needs to be in no doubt at all that we would not allow this to happen without those consequences. Clearly, the Defence Secretary has said this is a different matter given that Ukraine isn't a member of NATO when it comes to direct Western military intervention. But nonetheless, we will be very robust in our action. I know that President Biden is very much committed to that, and of course he has been in touch with Prime Minister Boris Johnson about that.
Look, I've asked you about two major challenges facing the government. I could equally have asked about the cost of living and the energy prices, or Brexit and Northern Ireland, or the ballooning fiscal deficit, or about the Chinese Communist Party's infiltration of Parliament. Yet all of that is being dwarfed this morning and day after day by the series of revelations about conduct in number 10 Downing Street and, by the way, the conduct of the Prime Minister and Mrs. Johnson. When do you plan to tell Boris Johnson that if the Conservative Party is to lead us through these challenges, he can no longer be Prime Minister? You can't afford him anymore.
Well, I don't agree with that analysis. I think Boris Johnson should, of course, remain as our Prime Minister. And I'll tell you why. It's precisely for the conversation we were just having now. It was the Prime Minister that made that call about having the mass booster programme, which has ensured we're getting through the worst Omicron. At the same time, he made the call, despite the huge pressure, and you may have remembered this, I recall it, around having a further lockdown in the face of that Omicron variant. He made the right call and has meant that we've managed to have the most open economy in Europe and the most vaxxed economy in Europe. The two are linked together. And I think when it comes to those big calls, he's made the right call. Now, of course, I don't diminish for a second that the kind of events that we've seen were totally wrong. I was angered by them. My constituents were angered by them. The whole country was angered by them. And it's absolutely right. The Prime Minister said we'll get to the bottom of them. And I'll tell you that when he responds to the House of Commons, as he's committed to doing so, he will make sure that we address the kind of culture that has allowed that to happen in the first place.
It's going to have to be a pretty dramatic response. I mean, at the very least, your job is to get the Conservative Party back into government. You've turned an 80-seat majority 2 years ago into what is now a consistent 10% deficit in the polls. And that is down to Mr. Johnson. He is the obstacle to your doing your job.
Well, we all know that opinion polls vary. What matters to me
is that what matters
to the British people is, first of all, they rightly expect us to get a grip of this situation. It was totally wrong, the events that happened. It's absolutely right the Prime Minister's apologised, and he will need to take further steps, and he will take those further steps when he makes a statement to the House of Commons. But it is also the case that we need to address not just COVID, and thank goodness we're making progress as we come out of Omicron, but also on the consequences of COVID, whether that's clearing the NHS backlog or whether that's rebuilding the economy. We need that kind of leadership to get us through it. And that's what people expect. Of course, we take these things seriously and we must address them, but we must also address the consequences of COVID.
But what could he possibly say about what we already know has taken place that would change opinions about that culture you yourself mentioned, Downing Street and in Whitehall? I mean, what could he possibly say?
Well, of course, it's important that we first get to the facts of everything that happened. Now, the Prime Minister has already apologised in respect of one event that happened. We need to get all the facts. That's what Sue Gray's doing through her report. We need to look at how that stacks up against the rules at the time. And then the Prime Minister needs to respond to that. Now, you wouldn't expect me to get into the detail of that response, but what I can tell you from the many conversations I've had with the Prime Minister and what you saw from him in the House on Wednesday is that he is committed to upping our game. We must improve the culture. We must do better. I hear people's anger. I know it, and we've got to respond to that.
Yeah, but, you know, he himself said at PMQs, there was a party, I was there. I mean, we don't need Sue Gray to tell us. Tim, one of your own MPs, Tim Loughton, this morning has made that point. We don't need to know what Sue Gray might or might not have found in the dusty files or from some junior employees. He's told us himself.
Well, I think it's important to understand what the Sue Gray inquiry is doing. It's not just in relation to the event that happened, I believe, on the 20th of May. It first of all looks at the range of events where there's been speculation about what may have happened. But in addition to that, crucially, it also allows people to come forward and bring forward any further allegations so they can properly be examined. Once we've got a full picture of the facts independently, that will then allow the Prime Minister to respond to it. Now, of course, that is going to require a change of culture. And I know that the Prime Minister is committed to leading that. And I know that the Prime Minister feels a sincere sense of regret and has apologised profoundly for what happened, and that is genuine. But I think people need to hear that in the statement that he will make in response to the Sue Gray report.
Look, you know, we can bandy words about what Sue Gray may or may not produce. She can't do anything about it, actually, because all she can do is say what the facts are. In the end, in the slightly bizarre situation, it's the Prime Minister himself who will decide whether he, the Prime Minister, has broken the ministerial code. I mean, that's another piece of madness which we can return to another time. But I want to take you on to, if you like, the larger issue here, which we know about. Because there's a lot that we already know. And forgive me if I'm going to take a bit of time to lay this out. We know that 16th of April, 2021, night before Prince Philip's funeral, 2 boozy parties. 18th December 2020, cheese and wine night, days after London went into Tier 3. 16th of December 2020. 15th December 2020. 14th December 2020, Conservative Party headquarters, party in the basement, I think. 10th of December, party at Department for Education. They've owned up to that. Parties, 27th of November 2020. 25th November 2020. 13th November 2020. 20th of May 2020, Prime Minister spoke about it this week. Make the most of the lovely weather. Prime Minister finally admitted to joining that party himself, the 15th of May 2020. These are the things we already know about. We don't have to have a civil servant to tell us about them. Oh, and by the way, there's every Friday wine time. Now, it's taken me ages to set that out. You're the party chairman. There were a lot of parties. All the while, people in their thousands were sticking to the rules, and your people were breaking them. one word, shameful, right? Just shameful.
Yes, it was completely unacceptable that this happened. I feel
unacceptable is a political word. I
feel I'm happy to use whichever adjectives you choose to express my anger at what happened. I'm angry about what happened. The Prime Minister is angry about what happened. It should not have happened. There needs to be a change in the culture. But what I would say to you is that it is important and it's right to ensure that we find the full facts of what happened. Of course, we've seen some of it and we can go through the detail of each one of them, but we need to get that full picture, which will then enable the Prime Minister to respond effectively. He will make a statement to Parliament. He will be held accountable in Parliament for his actions. I think that that is the proper and right process. And I don't for a minute step back or resile from the sense of anger that people feel about this. The question is, what do we do now? We need to find out the facts, and then the Prime Minister needs to respond effectively and to address the culture in Downing Street. And I know that he is committed to doing that.
Look, I know this is your job to come on and defend him, but, you know, it feels like the Prime Minister himself is part of the culture. And if I may say, everybody thinks you're a decent bloke, you're an honourable person. On that 20th of May, you were at the podium in Downing Street, giving the Downing Street briefing, telling us in good faith that we were not permitted to meet more than one other person outside our household. 1 hour later, the Prime Minister's out there in the party. I mean, he's made an absolute mug of you personally. I mean, don't you feel... how can you defend this?
Well, I'm not seeking to defend it, and nor is the Prime Minister. And if you look at what he said to the House of Commons on Wednesday, he gave a sincere apology for what happened. He gave an explanation for what had happened. It should not have happened, and that was a failure. And he has, in credit to the Prime Minister, owned up to that. The question for us now is how we go broader than just this and look at the wider cultural issues. But there's also a wider question about, given where we are with Omicron, as we emerge, what do we need to do? And I think alongside addressing this, we need to address the consequences of COVID, whether that's rebuilding the economy, whether that's cost of living, whether that is clearing the NHS backlog. And we also need to get that focus on that. And I know that the Prime Minister is committed to doing so.
Look, let me... you know, in the old days, people would have resigned by now, wouldn't they? I mean, but let's just deal with a specific example, because I think you've given me the answers that I guess you have to give. But I wonder if the government really understands what this anger is about. Let's take the weekend of April 16th, 17th and 18th last year. Let me remind you what took place on that Saturday. There was Her Majesty, Queen, isolated at the funeral of her husband of 70 years. She's unable to sit with her own family. If you don't, and let's not split hairs about the regulations, about the Sucre and all that kind of stuff. But most of the country was thinking about this that weekend. And I just wonder what kind of people have not just one, but two boozy farewell parties on the Friday night before this happens. I mean, when you have to go into Downing Street and meet these people, morally, how do you feel about that?
Well, first of all, we all shared and respected the tremendous dignity and selflessness that the Queen showed on this occasion, as she has done throughout her reign. And I was disgusted at the fact that there were parties taking place before this profound event of national mourning in our nation's history. It shouldn't have happened, and it was wrong. They have already apologised for doing so. It was just plain wrong, and it shouldn't have happened. But the point I'm making to you, Trevor, is that I think in order to move on from this, we first of all need to establish the full facts of what happened at all the different alleged events that took place, and that's the purpose of the Sucre inquiry. The next step is then for the Prime Minister to come to the House of Commons, to give a full response, to be held to account for that. But I can tell you that the Prime Minister is genuinely committed, both in demonstrating his remorse and apology for what happened, but also in taking steps to ensure that we address the kind of culture in Downing Street that enabled something like that to happen, which clearly should never have happened in the first place.
But I suppose what I'm really trying to get at, Mr. Dowden, is that I understand the process and all of that, but I just wonder whether, Prime Minister, or you really understand that that process, however clean it is not going to answer the question that is being asked out there in the country. And if you'll forgive me, I've talked about this once before on this programme, and I hoped never to have to do it again. But I think there are thousands, millions of people across the country who will feel, frankly, rather as I do. Let's go back to that April 17th, 18th weekend. And I just want to say something about what I did that during the week. And I think other people have exactly the same story. That week, I saw my two daughters at various times outside. One was pregnant, one was very ill. Their mother, stepmother, and I weren't allowed to meet them together. We all stuck to the spirit and the letter of the rules. On the Saturday, after watching the funeral of Prince Philip, I went to one of my friends' 70th birthday parties. He'd hired a tent. He's got loads of friends, but he'd hired a tent for just 6 of us, so we could sit outside. He stuck to the spirit and the letter of the rules. At that dinner, I get a call. My daughter's collapsed, and as you will know, for months she'd been isolated. She was ill. By the following morning, she had died, and she had stuck to the spirit and letter of the rules. Now, there are going to be thousands of people who have that story in their background. And if I may say so, you are in here telling me about a civil servant's inquiry. That will not answer that anger. Does the Prime Minister really understand why people are angry?
Well, first of all, Trevor, I know how much you have suffered during this period, and I know how much so many people in this country have suffered, the privations that they have been subject to, the steadfastness with which people obeyed the rules. And it is totally wrong if there has been any way in which, and we've seen some examples of this, those rules have not been fully obeyed in Downing Street. What I'm trying to offer to you and to your viewers who may be watching this programme is to explain to you how the government is seeking to move forward through this. First of all, to establish all of the facts of what happened, and then the Prime Minister will be held to account in Parliament for what happened. And I want to assure you, and I want to assure any of your viewers listening, I've discussed this with the Prime Minister on many occasions. He has a sincere sense of remorse and regret at what happened, as do I, as do other members of the government.
All right, look, let me get back, forgive me, let me get back to actually doing my job here. The truth of the matter still is the politics of this are that you're facing a consistent poll deficit, biggest in eight years. And in reality, you know what the most decisive thing you as party chair could do about this. So let me just ask you again, when are you going to tell the Prime Minister that he himself is the principal object that stands in the way of your doing your job successfully, which is to get the Conservative Party re-elected to government?
Well, I do not believe that the Prime Minister should resign for the reasons that we have discussed in this interview. I do, though, think it is essential that we address the kind of failings that allowed this to happen, that the Prime Minister is held to account for what happened and addresses that in Parliament, and that we also build on the kind of work that we have done with the vaccine rollout programme to address the subsequent challenges of COVID, whether that's clearing the NHS backlog or rebuilding the economy. I think that that is the right approach rather than going through a period of divisive leadership contests, which is not the sense that I get of what British people want us to be focusing on. They want us to focus on the job at hand of dealing with Omicron and then the consequences of COVID.
Dowden, thank you very much.